I don't know who first looked at these pods and decided they were ready to eat, because they don't exactly advertise themselves as food. If anything, they look as though they ought to be mildly poisonous. In fact, you crack one open and inside, it's just peas, completely ordinary green peas. It's a little disappointing, really. The packaging promises dragons, and the contents are a Tuesday evening. The color comes from the same family of pigments that give blueberries and red cabbage their color. Plants are surprisingly economical like that. They seem to have found a chemical they like and just keep reusing it. Picking peas is one of those jobs that changes the way you see. At first you spot the obvious pods, then after a few minutes your eyes tune in and suddenly they're everywhere. It makes you wonder what else you walk past every day without noticing, simply because your brain hasn't decided it's worth looking for. I also like the fact that peas are quietly pulling their weight underground. Their roots work alongside bacteria that can capture nitrogen from the air and leave some of it behind in the soil. So while they're busy producing dinner, they're also doing a bit of housekeeping for whatever gets planted here next. It's quite a generous arrangement, really, although I suspect the bacteria would argue they're doing most of the heavy lifting. The danger with harvesting peas is optimism. You tell yourself you've probably found most of them then. Just as you're about to leave, one catches your eye, then another, then another. Somewhere in this patch there's almost certainly one pod I'll completely miss until next week, when it'll be the size of a canoe and entirely my own fault. There's something oddly satisfying about harvesting onions. Maybe it's because, unlike most vegetables, they've spent months quietly doing all their work out of sight. You get the occasional clue above ground, but the main event has been happening underneath the whole time. It does make me wonder who first thought to dig one up. Imagine looking at a patch of strappy green leaves and deciding, I reckon there's something worth eating under there. It's either a moment of remarkable insight or the result of somebody losing a bet. They're also one of those vegetables that ask for surprisingly little applause. Tomatoes get all the attention, pumpkins have competitions, chilies have fan clubs, but take onions away from the kitchen and suddenly an astonishing number of recipes become noticeably less interesting. Every time I clear a bed, I'm reminded that an allotment is never really finished. You don't complete one job and tick it off forever. You simply make space for the next one. Gardening is less like writing a to-do list and more like standing on a moving walkway. You're making progress, but there's always another few feet appearing in front of you. It's one of the reasons I enjoy it. There isn't really an end point. If there were, we'd probably get bored. The soil's changed quite a bit since spring as well. Months ago, this would have felt completely different under the spade. Roots have been growing through it. Worms have been tunneling around. Fungi have been doing their invisible work. We tend to think of the garden as changing because the plants get bigger, but most of the activity is happening where we can't see it. I sometimes think healthy soil is a bit like a city at night. From above it looks quiet, but underneath there's an extraordinary amount going on. Sweet corn always feels like a slightly optimistic crop to grow in Britain. It's a plant that evolved in warm climates, and every year we confidently stick it outside and hope our summer remembers to cooperate. To be fair, it usually does well enough. Sweet corn seems to have lower expectations than the gardeners growing it. Keeping the weeds down around it is one of those jobs that's easy to put off for another week. The trouble is, weeds are remarkably good at taking advantage of procrastination. Leave them for a few days and they act as though you've gifted them the place. Every now and then, I have to remind myself that an allotment isn't a battle against nature. It's more of a negotiation. I get to grow the things I want, and nature gets regular opportunities to explain that she had other ideas. I wonder what people from 1,000 years ago would make of an allotment. I don't mean the vegetables, they'd recognize most of those. They'd know onions, peas, beans, even sweet corn eventually found its way across the world. No, I think what would puzzle them is why someone would spend hours growing food for enjoyment rather than survival. For most of history, if you had a patch of land, it wasn't a hobby, it was dinner. It's an odd reversal when you think about it. Modern life has become so comfortable in some ways that we now deliberately choose activities that are difficult. We run marathons instead of catching buses. We lift heavy objects in gyms instead of paying people to do it. We grow vegetables even though the supermarket has done a perfectly good job of growing them already. Maybe we're trying to buy back little pieces of a life we accidentally engineered away. One of the things gardening gives you is visible progress. That's surprisingly rare these days. So much of modern work happens inside computers. You answer emails, update spreadsheets, move files from one folder to another. At the end of the day, you've often been busy, but it's difficult to point at anything and say, I made that. A garden doesn't have that problem. If you spend an hour here, the hour is still visible tomorrow. Sometimes it's visible months later. Every bed is a collection of previous afternoons. I quite like that. There's also something deeply reassuring about how completely uninterested plants are in our schedules. They don't care if you've had a stressful week. They don't know there's an election. They've never heard of interest rates. I've often thought that gardens have their own timescale. Not slow exactly, just indifferent. A weed isn't in a hurry. An onion isn't impatient. A fruit tree has absolutely no interest in whether you'd like apples by next Thursday. Everything happens when it's ready. Perhaps that's why an hour out here feels different from an hour almost anywhere else. The clock is still ticking, but it somehow matters less. You start noticing things you normally edit out. The sound of bees moving between flowers. The blackbird that always seems to arrive the moment the soil is disturbed. The smell after a brief shower of rain. None of those things are remarkable on their own. But they become remarkable simply because you've stopped long enough to notice them. One thing that still amazes me is how incredibly successful weeds are. Human beings have built cities, crossed oceans, walked on the moon, and yet a dandelion will happily appear through a crack in a car park and carry on as though nothing unusual has happened. It's easy to think of weeds as the villains of the garden, but they're really just opportunists. If nature sees a patch of bare ground, her first instinct is to cover it with something. She doesn't like empty space very much. From nature's point of view, A perfectly tidy vegetable bed is actually quite a strange idea. We've basically walked into a natural system and said, I'd like this square to contain only onions, this one only beans, and absolutely nothing else, thank you. One of the reasons some weeds are so difficult to get rid of is that they've evolved alongside agriculture for thousands of years. They've had generation after generation to adapt to exactly the sort of disturbance we create. In a way, they've been studying us for longer than we've been studying them. It's a slightly unsettling thought. I do wonder which plant was the first to realize that humans are surprisingly predictable. There they go again. They've made another lovely patch of bare soil for us. There's also a lesson in how different plants solve the same problem. Some race upwards as fast as possible. Some spread sideways. Some produce thousands of seeds. Others invest everything in deep roots and simply refuse to leave. There isn't one perfect strategy. Evolution is less like inventing the best design and more like trying absolutely everything to see what survives. That's probably why gardens never become boring. Every plant has its own personality, not in the literal sense, obviously, but in the way it approaches life. Peas are climbers. Pumpkins are conquerors. Sweet corn is quietly ambitious. Mint is an organized crime syndicate. I know that's unfair on mint. Actually, no, it isn't. If mint ever develops the ability to open gates, we're all in serious trouble. It's funny how quickly a garden changes your definition of success. Outside the allotment, if something doubles in size unexpectedly, it's usually a problem. Here, that's the entire objective. Unless it's slugs, or bindweed, or the grass. Those are all politely asked to keep their ambitions to themselves. I suppose that's gardening in a nutshell. You're not trying to stop nature. You're just having a friendly discussion about which bits get to stay. One of the easiest mistakes to make in gardening is to focus on what's ready today. On paper, it doesn't look like very much is happening. But that's because gardens don't reward impatience, they reward continuity. There's always something just starting, something finding its stride, and something that's still deciding whether this summer is warm enough to make an effort. I quite like that every visit to the allotment feels different. Not because everything changes overnight, but because there's always another little sign that time has moved on. A new leaf, a first flower, the first fruit, the first harvest. It's easy to overlook those moments because none of them are particularly dramatic on their own. But add enough small moments together, and eventually you realize you've grown an entire garden. I don't know why I bother saying, I'll just pick a few. You take the obvious ones, then you notice a little cluster you'd somehow missed. Then you step back, and another one appears. Cherries seem to have mastered the art of only becoming visible after you've decided you've finished. I've also discovered that no matter how careful I am, there'll always be one that looks absolutely perfect until I pick it up and discover something else got there first. If I were a blackbird, I'd probably have my eye on the best cherries too. Actually, blackbirds have got it pretty easy. They don't need ladders, they don't need baskets, and nobody complains if they eat half of one and move on to the next. The funny thing is that the tree probably prefers the birds anyway. The bit we're interested in is the fruit. The bit the tree's interested in is the stone. Everything else is just there to tempt something into carrying it away. It's quite a clever arrangement, really. "Excuse me," says the tree, "would you mind doing a bit of seed distribution? I'll throw in a free snack." Somewhere, millions of years ago, that strategy worked so well that we're still falling for it. Although I suspect humans have slightly misunderstood the assignment. Instead of carrying the stones a few hundred meters away, we've spent centuries planting cherry trees in gardens, breeding bigger and sweeter fruit, and arguing about the best variety. Here's a question I've never found a good answer to. Why is tying knots so much harder when someone else is watching? If I'm on my own, no problem. Put a camera in front of me, and suddenly my fingers behave as though they've only just met. Mind you, onions are surprisingly forgiving. They've spent months growing, and now the final step is basically to leave them alone for a while. That's not a bad design as vegetables go. I've heard people describe gardening as hard work, and it certainly can be, but quite a lot of it is actually waiting. This plot has a habit of reminding me that plants don't really understand the concept of, "I'll be back in a few days." You turn your back for a week, and they've appointed a new management team. The greenhouse looked fairly respectable the last time I was here. Now it's bordering on rainforest. Tomatoes are one of those plants that seem to grow with genuine enthusiasm. If they could fill in paperwork, I'd be receiving planning applications for a second floor. It's funny how quickly your standards change as a gardener. A non-gardener walks into a greenhouse like this and sees complete chaos. A gardener walks in and thinks, "Actually, I've seen worse." The ants are still here as well. I'd rather hoped they'd taken the hint. Apparently not. The courgettes have been quietly getting on with life while I've been distracted elsewhere. They're another crop that likes to keep you humble. Check them one day and they're nowhere near ready. Miss a couple of days and suddenly you're harvesting something the size of a cricket bat. And finally, a hook. It's hardly the most exciting addition to an allotment, but I have a feeling it'll end up being one of the most useful. Gardening is full of things like that. You spend ages thinking about varieties, compost and fertilizer, then one day a simple hook turns out to improve your quality of life far more than any of them ever did. Thanks very much for coming along with me. I hope you've enjoyed spending a bit of time on the allotment, and maybe picked up an interesting fact or two along the way. Until next time, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.